Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nugentino Cinema, a very special edition. I'm here with Kay in person at the Mayan Theatre in Denver, and thanks for being here.
Yeah.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
So we saw Beau's Afraid, directed by Ari Aster, and it stars Joaquin Phoenix. It's 3 hours long. It's his follow-up to Midsummer and Hereditary. And right off the bat, did you want to just give your thoughts on the movie?
Oh man, I have a lot of thoughts on the movie, and so it's really kind of difficult to know where to begin. Do you want to go ahead and break it down by act? It seems like there's pretty distinctive acts, and they're all so dense in themselves that it's kind of I guess I could say overall, my feeling is that I really liked parts of it and I really didn't like parts of it, and I wanted to love it all the way through, but the third act that I had been warned would trip me up definitely did that. So I think it would be easier to kind of break down my feelings on it as we discuss it, because it's hard to just say overall. I just have mixed feelings, I guess. What did you think?
Yeah, I can totally understand that. We are coming right out of the movie, we just saw it just now, so
just a minute ago.
It's hard to collect all the thoughts. But yeah, it starts out in a very chaotic Beau at his apartment in the city, and it's just sort of this nightmare kind of vibe where he's just being chased by lots of criminals, and that's the main first chunk of the movie. Did you have any specific thoughts on that?
Sorry, bad timing on my part. Yeah, so I thought, sorry, like you said, we just got out of the movie, so I'm still kind of collecting my thoughts a little bit. I thought it's an interesting kind of encapsulation over the course of a life, and I think the first part is definitely obviously the film starts with him being born. So it starts there, and then it seems that the three different acts kind of encapsulate different parts of your life, different phases of life. And so the first one, he's very scared of the world. The world is very chaotic. It's overwhelming. He doesn't really know how to navigate anything that's going on. Everything that can go wrong he's constantly being blamed for things that aren't his fault, and that carries through the film. So yeah, I think it captured the feeling of anxiety a lot, really well, and it starts to kind of set up the tie-ins about medications and therapy and different elements as well. So it kind of is just encapsulating the chaos of the world and the way that he's internalizing it and the way that it becomes anxiety. And so I really liked the first part of it because I felt like it was a really good and strong commentary on the way that we as a society we're hyper aware at all times of the things that are going wrong around us, whether it's news or just walking outside, you see all of these terrible things happening. And so it's you medicate or you go to therapy or you try to visit family, I don't know. But that can be its own thing. So I felt like that first part was really strong. I really liked it, and I was very invested in the direction it was going in. But what did you think about it?
I liked it. There's actually a short film called Beau that Ari Aster did in 2011, I think, way before he had directed any feature film. But the first part in the city feels the closest to that short film. In the short film, he's just, it's a different actor, but it's he's calling his mom over and over again, asking if it's safe to go outside. There's all this chaotic stuff happening in an apartment building. And there's even one line that's taken directly from the short film where there's somebody walking down the hall and they're like, "You're fucked, bud." And that's taken directly from the short film. But that first part felt pretty close to the short film, or an extension of that. Obviously, it's a lot bigger and grander. But yeah, I like the first act. It's I've heard some people compare this movie to a movie called Freddy Got Fingered by Tom Green.
I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I think I actually can see similarities in that it's just very chaotic. It's very in your face. It's constantly being provocative and just trying to shock, but it's not without any reason. It's supposed to obviously, I think, represent his anxiety and just his fears and all this stuff. And I thought the first act was good. And before we go any farther, I just wanted to say, I figured we would just talk about spoilers openly.
Yes.
So if you haven't seen the movie, then don't watch. But yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I like that first part. From there, I don't know if I would call this moving into the second act, but it's sort of a different zone. They go to Nathan Lane in Amy Ryan's house. Well, Beau gets hit by a car, and then he's taken in by a family, and they're sort of taking care of him, and he's staying in their daughter's room, and she's very upset about this, and that was an interesting sort of diversion from there. Yeah. Did you have any thoughts on that specifically?
Yeah, so it's like he's then kind of, so the whole thing is him kind of grappling with expectations versus reality in life, the purpose of family, his own valuing of family and what it means to him. And so I think the first part is very much like the isolation away from other people and the way that can cause anxiety and the way that the focus then becomes so much of what's wrong because you don't really have anything to balance that out. Like he doesn't really have a lot of positive influence. But just really quickly to go back to the first part before going on too far, I thought it was really interesting too that there's so much to do with space in the film, and I think you get that a lot in his camera movements. You get that a lot, especially in the beginning, like the way that he frames people in spaces, and they feel like really small and kind of like trapped sometimes, and then sometimes spaces feel like really big and like you're like walking around, and I liked that feeling in his apartment where like sometimes his apartment would feel like very small, and then other times like when he's walking to the third note or the second note, it feels like this really big space, and then he has kind of this one sanctuary away from the world, and then that's taken away. It's invaded very literally by the outside world, and they destroy everything. And I think what's also interesting is that in the first part, he starts setting up the relation of water and death. Yeah. So you see it over and over again, obviously very literally with the medication, like you must take it with water or you'll die. So there's kind of like this relation to water with life and death, but most prominently with death. And then you see it again, like when he gets the phone call to confirm that his mom died, and he had just started running the bath, and the water comes to pull out. And so I think that there's this recurring theme of water and death, and so I just wanted to kind of pin that too before we move on to the next part. But yes, when he shifts after being brutally attacked by being outside of his safety zone, eventually he is forced out of his home and kind of has this outside looking in perspective, and at that point when he's lost his sanctuary, he is attacked by the world that he feared in the ways that he exactly feared, which is kind of like this practice in paradoxical intention as well, where it's like, I feel like Ari Aster is doing this thing where he's like, okay, everything that you're afraid of, make it as, just lean into it. Like, if you're scared of something, put yourself in that position in order to get over it. And I feel like that's a lot of what he's doing in the film, and he forces Beau to do that too. But then yes, when it moves to the second part, then he's kind of like, it's the opposite, where it's like, in the first part he was so isolated from people, and that was causing his anxiety. And then in the second part, he's smothered by family, and that's what causes his anxiety. So it's this really interesting kind of flip-flop of seeing things from the outside and then from too much of the inside, where like he's being monitored, has a tracking bracelet on, like he's so like compartmentalized by these people. He doesn't have any autonomy with what he's able to do. He's not able to leave when he wants to leave. When he does think he's going to be relieved, he's drugged. And so I think that's a really interesting kind of like shift into this, maybe not the second part as a whole, but into that second phase of the story.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, that was a tangent, but what did you think?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's kind of like, I feel like a lot throughout the whole movie, there's just like Murphy's Law going on. Like anything wrong that can happen goes wrong, and like from like little small things that are like relatable in terms of having anxiety, like being at a store and like just him drinking a water because he's so thirsty, being 20 cents short, but because like we're in this absurd world, the guy's like screaming at him that he's going to call the cops, and that's sort of like, it's just basic everyday anxiety, but like played out for real in the movie, like how it would feel in his head, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, exactly.
And I feel like the whole movie takes place in this sort of unreal state, like nightmare state. The entire movie could be just like a simple like course of events. Like his mom, like he gets called that he thinks his mom died or something like that, and he has to go and journey to her house. But everything happening in the movie is sort of through the filter of his mind, what's going on in his mind, where he has anxiety and depression and all these things and just guilt and all of that. So I thought that was interesting, that it sort of took place in this unreal space the whole time.
Yeah, lots of guilt. That was definitely a running theme as well. And that ties in so much, like all of the different characters have their own kinds of guilt and that they're working through too, and their own anxieties and things. So like even the family that is adopting him, like it's as a placeholder, and you know, there's all of the grief and everything around the loss of their son, and so like you get the kind of idea of the family dynamic that way, and it's like this is why they're so protective, this is why they're smothering, this is why they don't want to let him go. And I think it's interesting, we had already kind of flagged spoilers, so from kind of stepping out and getting a more macro perspective of the film and understanding the storyline from the ending, it's interesting because the idea is that his mom hired these people, but didn't expect them to need Beau the way that like she needed him. And so like they were, I'm sure, supposed to bring him at a certain point, but like they just don't. Like he tries to go and he can't. And so it's like they have like their own things that she didn't account for. But yeah, it's very multi-layered in the way that they take it on. And then there's the little sister, and like all of her stuff, and then her suicide, which feels very, I don't know. I started to it started to lose me a little bit around that point, and it kind of kept my interest, but it that was the point of decline, I think, for me, where it started to slip a little bit more downhill. Yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. I was like getting carried away. But yeah, did you have any thoughts like kind of on the family dynamic or that? Or there was also the kind of like commando guy who lived outside and was like representation of their lost brother, but like not really. And he was like this very kind of like hyper-aggressive, unstable like version, and so it almost makes you wonder, because they had this very like glorified, pristine depiction of their son who died, but you almost wonder, like with the way that the film plays with like people being dead aren't really dead, it kind of makes you wonder too, like if that guy like was their son in a way, and he came back in a way that they maybe like emotionally didn't recognize him, and so kind of like keep him quarantined in this own like and hyper medicated outside of their home. He's almost like a pet kind of. So I thought that like that whole family dynamic was interesting too. Like he's really trying to like piece apart all of the dysfunctional elements of family while keeping it cohesive in the story, and I think he does that pretty well.
Yeah, for sure. It felt like Nathan Lane and Amy Ryan were sort of like his idealized, maybe what he would want parents to be, but like,
sure.
But then you know you have the brothers, like friends that you were talking about, who lives in the trailer, the army guy, and then the daughter are sort of like the nightmare just pushing back in. It's like it's not gonna happen. You're not gonna have a happy, ideal family. Like, yeah, that's sort of how I interpreted it. But it was interesting with the corporation MW, because I had seen sort of advertisements where they were like, you know, putting this mysterious company out there. It's like, so there's like meals he eats and like medication he takes that are all coming from the MW company.
Yeah.
And I don't know if people would have caught on to it earlier, because it kind of seems obvious now, but like I didn't realize that his mom ran the company until towards the end when he arrives at the house. It's like, of course, it's MW, and her name's Mona Wasserman. But I thought it was interesting that he was sort of under the umbrella of this like pretty rich family, but he's kind of living, unless I'm misinterpreting something, he's like living in poverty on his own, but he has this mom who's very rich, and even if he has sort of issues, there's like all kinds of, it says they have like rehabilitation homes and like all these crazy things like in their company, and you would think he could be helped, but I don't know if it's in terms of like he wants to stay away from his family, because she's saying towards the end that like, you know, she's upset because he never talks to her, he pushes her away, things like that. So I don't know if that's the reasoning for that. If he's choosing, I think we were touching on this in the beginning, if he's choosing to isolate himself because he just can't stand to be around his mother, even if he like feels guilty for that and tries to like on the surface act like nothing's wrong, even though there obviously is a lot wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the general theme of the film is expectations versus reality, and I think that his living situation at the beginning is actually touched on at the end. So when he is at his mother's house at the end, there's a moment where he's kind of walking through her office, and you see all of the different projects, and his apartment was one.
That's what I was wondering. I thought that might be the case.
So I think it's like at the end he kind of tries to take on like elitism and capitalism a little bit, and he does that a little bit through the film too. But at the end I think that there's like this kind of idea that like there is this dream utopian living situation that she's created, but in reality like she wanted to create this environment, this perfect environment and everything for her son, but in reality he was left alone and abandoned, or felt left alone and abandoned in the situation that was actually crumbled, decayed, like rotting. And so she may not have perceived it that way. Like we don't get to understand like her perception really. She's just this villain, which is one of my issues with the film. But we can kind of infer, I suppose, that she believed that she was giving him the best and saw that, you know, she thought that she was doing this, but in reality he was experiencing something entirely different. So that's the way that I kind of internalized that. But definitely, like, I loved the way that he tied the company in throughout, and then at the end you see that it's like this whole community, this whole neighborhood, or village, as like the whole village theme is tied in and everything too. So yeah, that's kind of how I interpreted that, but yeah, I just feel like at every opportunity he does like, this is what you think, or this is what this person thinks, or thinks that, you know, they're perceiving, but in reality it's entirely different. In the first part they set up the addiction to medication, or perhaps not addiction, but like necessity of medication. In certain situations for people, and then in the second act, like that's flipped, where it shifts from being, or I keep saying second act, second phase. It goes from being a tool to help him, like this cool new medication. Loved that part. I was cracking up through the first half of the film, really. And then in the second part, you see that it's like candy. It does nothing. It's just like a way of escapism. It's recreational. There's the point where the daughter takes 2 bottles and the dad is like, oh, don't mix those. And so there's kind of just like this normalcy of abuse of medication to the point where it's not even really doing anything anymore, and then you see how it pushes the daughter to the point where like she abused it to the point where it resulted in her death. And so I think that that's kind of an interesting thing too. It doesn't really carry into the final part of the film, but it's so heavily emphasized in those first two sections of the film. So I just wanted to point on that too before we moved on.
Yeah, it is interesting that the medication stuff doesn't seem to go through like I almost see it as a 4-act structure instead of a 3-act, but through the final 2 acts. Yeah. I know he originally wanted it to be 4 hours, so maybe that was
oh God.
Maybe that's why.
No offense to people who love it, but like I don't think I have 4 hours in me.
Yeah.
Oh man.
I mean, he's described it as a nightmare comedy, and I think it's a good way to interpret it.
I was laughing.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a comedy almost the whole time.
Very funny.
Yeah. But yeah, the medication stuff at the beginning is interesting, like, and especially what you're talking about in terms of being abused and becoming like candy. I mean, the daughter at one point is like literally like eating them like Tic Tacs like every 2 seconds.
Like that, yeah.
Yeah.
There were a couple of times where there's actually a few times in the film, 2 or 3, where Beau or other characters, like it almost makes you believe that they're about to, like at the beginning when he's laying down in bed and he's writing on the lid of the medication bottle, like it almost reads as like a note, like a farewell note.
That's kind of what I thought at first, but then I realized it was a message to his mom.
Right. And so there are a few times though where like that is kind of like built up, where you think that's going to happen and then it doesn't happen. So I think that that's interesting too. Like he's very, like he was very, I don't know, he pushed a lot of like very dark themes, and granted like lightened it with humor. I was laughing, but like he went to some dark places, like really dark. Yeah, that's all I had to say on that.
Yeah, definitely. It's a comedy, but it's a comedy out of like some of the darkest material in life. So it's interesting.
Yeah. And that's how it's marketed. So I shouldn't be surprised. But yeah, it truly, like, I could see a lot of people like feeling like having difficulties with elements of the film. You know, especially because with something like this that tackles so many different darker parts of life, like, you know, the casual viewer going in who may not really know what they're signing up for, like, might have a difficult time with it. So, I don't know. He just really was like, here's all of my fears in one movie.
Yeah, it seemed like, because I've watched some interviews with Ari Aster, and it does seem like, you know, he's very neurotic and like has anxiety himself. So it does seem like sort of a, not like exact, like I don't know anything about his personal life exactly, but like an interpretation of his anxieties and fears and stuff like that. Yeah, for sure. But from there, it moves on from the Nathan Lane stuff. Nathan Lane, who I thought was very good in the movie, or at least not that he has that much, but I thought he was funny as like the dad character. But from there, well, Beau is sort of not framed, but when the daughter like kills herself, the mom comes in and like pretty much blames him for it. It's like, what did you do? It becomes insanely chaotic. He bashes through a window and then runs through the forest. And from there, Beau discovers a community in the middle of the woods. Weird sort of like in the mind, interpreting like his hopes or his dreams that were sort of, or not dreams, but expectations of what he should be in life. And his disappointment in himself, things like that. But what did you think of that section?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, like the end of the sequence of him being adopted and the death of that girl, and the way that at the end of that you see like the stepmother's expectations or ideas of him being swapped. Like, she thought that he was going to be this replacement for her son, and it's even painted on the wall, but in exchange she just, like, in doing that, she lost another child. So there's like a lot of grappling with like parental neglect and what you think a parent should give you and what they're capable of giving, and how there's sometimes an imbalance between those things, even though like and it's touched on later, we'll get to this, but like even when like a parent wants to give you everything, like it may not actually be what you need. But then yeah, I think that point is kind of where my feelings about the film started to become a little less gung-ho and a little bit more cautiously reserved. That part where it becomes like very kind of abstract and artistic was one of my favorite parts of the film, and I feel like people who know my taste probably wouldn't be surprised by that at all. But I loved that, and it tied in again to like water as death in life. Like there's the part where where like when he's an old man, it's like he faced the fact that he was a coward, and then a pool of water appeared, and so it's like water again and again and again is death. And even in that part, and I think there was even a moment in the previous part where he's with the family where like water is related to it as well, though maybe I'm making that up, I don't quite recall. But yeah, so I really liked that part of the film, and I think that as much as it was a commentary on the expectations he had for himself in his life, it was also very much a commentary on the expectations that society gives us. And obviously I can't speak for a man's experience, but like in my understanding of my life experience and understanding of society from my perspective, it seems very much that a lot of people, but specifically men, are given this idea of if you do these things will happen. Like you go out into the world, you find a place to live, you get a good job, you get a wife, you have 3 kids, you know, you live this fulfilled life. And granted, he does undermine that for himself by having it all taken away, and then it becomes this other thing. But I feel like that was really the point of that part of the film, is like you see the isolation, you see the smothering, and then you see him trying to understand where his place is in all of it, as a child and as somebody who has a longing to be a parent, but feels that there's not the ability for him to do that because of the circumstances of his life, or just because he is a coward, I guess, is the main bottom line that Ari Aster keeps hitting, that he's a coward and incapable of having the life that he wants because of fear. And I think that it was thoughtfully done. I think it was really creative, and I really, like I said, I think it was like my favorite part of the film, especially from a visual aspect. But I struggle with it a little bit, though, because that's really when like his depictions of women start to come in more in full force, because throughout the film too we're getting the intersplicing of him as a young boy and like his view of this young girl, and that kind of ties in, but more and more like at this point on, women become more involved in the film in terms of like his perceptions of women, his expectations of women, and I feel like he kind of starts to show his hand a little bit there in a way that wasn't satisfying for me. So yeah, like in the I just was turned off kind of, and I understand it's a commentary on society and his expectations and expectations put upon us, but I also feel that if your whole point of the film is to kind of undermine and deconstruct these things, he could have done it a little bit more, he could have done a little bit more there with that. I just feel like maybe it wasn't his point and it wasn't his priority, which is okay, but I just wasn't satisfied with that.
Yeah, I can definitely see what you're saying. I have a better phrase, objectification of women, I think, quite literally at a certain point, and that was really weird. But I just saw it through Beau's perspective. Like, that's how I interpreted it. It's just like,
okay. Yeah.
It's through his very warped perspective. And I don't think it's necessarily saying that any of that is right. It's just that it's like and I don't think it's even Beau doing anything maliciously. It's just that he has a very tilted, warped like interpretation of reality.
Right, and I agree with that, and I don't think that there's any problem. Like, obviously, like every perspective deserves its say, and there should be representation for every experience, and that is a very, like, from my understanding, a very real part of the experience, for men, and the expectation that you're going to have these things, or that you should have these things. And so my issue isn't with that. My issue is with the way that he shows women as a part of that, and the way that it continues to kind of devolve from there. He includes women in a valuable way. Like, they are their own people. They have their own desires and all of these things. But at the same time, you kind of just feel like they are forces for him to push against or be pushed by, and granted that's everybody in the film, but I just felt like there was a little bit less, I don't know, it didn't feel satisfying to me. I don't know, maybe I'm being too a little, like, I want more for myself in it, and maybe I should release some of that and kind of just let it be what it should be, but or what it wants to be. But for me, I struggled to connect, I guess is the best way I can say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. In terms of him villainizing the mother, I think that's sort of like, I saw it as almost like a Lynchian. Like, have you seen Lost Highway?
Not for a long time. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, some of the stuff, like at the beginning, when he's on the phone, he's talking to the UPS guy, and like the UPS guy is just like horrifically describing how this mother's head was crushed. That sort of reminded me of like something like in Lost Highway, the Nightmare Man, like Robert Blake, the one who's like I'm in your house, like when they're on the phone, like in that scene. Sort of reminded me of stuff like that. And the mother, like when there's like the scene of like her in the bathroom, which is another thing of the water, because there's an image that repeats throughout the movie of the bathtub overflowing.
Yeah.
And there's a scene where he's in his mom's bathroom, and like she's screaming at him, and there's the attic, which comes in later. And there's this weird sort of like dark tunnel way where it's like shooting backwards. That sort of reminded me of a Lynchian, like just dark, like villainization, but like to me it's just, again, through the perspective, like I think it's just like he's horrified, and that's sort of like that just darkness being represented, but I also found some of it kind of comical.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely funny. Like I was laughing until the end. I even cracked up a little bit at the end. Well, not the end, but what you think is the end before the end. I actually have a lot I'd like to say about the bathtub scenes and the ending, but I don't want to get ahead of where we're at, because that's kind of a whole conversation in itself, and the way the film is structured and progresses is actually, I really like it. Because, yeah, it's like grappling with isolation, being smothered, kind of trying to find your identity in between and, you know, as a result of those things. And then he comes back around, like, he kind of has this emotional journey of loss and fulfillment through this play. And then kind of like realizes that like he wants to be a dad, but he can't be, and all of these things. And through that there is, as you mentioned, like everything with Parker Posey and all of that too. But yeah, there seems to either be, I feel like motherhood in the film is portrayed in two very specific ways. It's either like glorified, like, you know, Mary, like Saint Mary, Mother Mary, and it's like, you know, even at the end, like when he goes to his mother's
like the
house,
innocent Virgin Mary, like that kind of thing.
Mary, thank you. Yes, Virgin Mary. I don't know why I said Mother Mary, Catholic, but like. So there's like either this very like holy depiction of motherhood, like in the statuette, and like his kind of like holding his maybe ideal of his mother, however.
I didn't even connect that. That's true.
Yeah, so like he's carrying this kind of totem of motherhood, and like when his mom dies, it breaks, and then it's like when he's adopted, it's patched back to get together, but the glue is still drying, and then like he carries it with him, and then when he gives it to. So when he gives it away finally to a woman who is pregnant, you see that it's actually like fully mended again. You don't see it broken, and so it's like his vision of motherhood or like his ideal of motherhood has kind of been restored, and he's able to like give it away. I don't really know the significance of giving it, but like you see that his like idea of motherhood is restored. But then you see the way that that's contrasted so much with like the other depiction of motherhood, which is smothering and authoritarian and my way or the highway. It's fretful, it's anxious, and you see like where he gets all of this stuff, and I feel like it's kind of like blaming her for everything, like his anxieties, his fears, like, you know, he was hiding behind the corner because he was scared, and all of these things. And so I feel like there's either like a villainization of motherhood and the way that it can harm a person, or there's like this very holy depiction of motherhood. And I'm sure that's part of the point, is trying to reconcile those two things, but I don't really feel like they get reconciled.
Well, I don't think it's a villainization of motherhood in general. I think it's a villainization of like a certain kind of mother.
That's fair.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's like, I think these sort of things do exist, and like not everywhere.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't mean to say that they don't at all. Like, of course, these experiences are real. You know, people can either have like a very strong and like beautiful bond with their parent, or they can have one that's very traumatic. Like, I don't mean to nullify that at all. I just mean that like I don't feel that there's a lot of gray. I feel like it's either one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very. I would say it's very simply on Beau's side, but like even at the end, they're so. I don't know if I should jump right to that, but
yeah, I kind of forgot. I'm sorry, we left off.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're somewhere like I think we've covered mostly everything. So in the final act, he gets to his mother's house. He comes out of the woods, and I think it very kind of clearly is like,
which is its own metaphor, going into the woods and coming back out.
Yeah, but when he came out of the woods, it kind of felt to me like he was in a very small wood space. It probably would have like taken him like 2 seconds to get across it, and like whatever happened in there was just some deep in his mind thing. But then he gets out of there. He gets a ride with somebody who works for the MW company, of course.
Of course.
And then he gets to his mother's house, and it's the funeral, and she's laying there without a head, and then you know. We get to the Parker Posey scene, and Parker Posey is a character that he met. It was like a young girl who met on a cruise.
Oh, I was thinking of the wrong person. Never mind, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, at some point when he's on this cruise, when he was a kid, he interpreted that she wanted him to wait for him or something weird.
Yeah.
And then she comes back, and that's some sort of reunion, and some stuff happens there, and then there's a sort of that the mother was actually not dead, and what did you think of all that stuff? Was that sort of act where I think you already said where your problems began?
So that's kind of where it started to lose me a little bit more, where I became a little bit more critical of not what he was doing, but like how he was doing it. So and I when I interrupted you a second ago, I'm sorry about that. I was thinking of the wrong. I'm terrible with names, is the thing. So when you said Parker Posey, I was thinking of the pregnant woman in the woods. I don't know her name. I was not that. That was my mistake.
I didn't recognize that actress. I just
she was lovely. But yeah, so with everything with I feel like the cruise scenes are intercut throughout the film to where there isn't really a distinctive point where we could discuss that. So I'm going to touch on it a little bit now. I have said a few times, but like I think that is really where he does solidify holy water with death, where you get that. And I said this before, but like his camera movements and the way that he stages shots is really, really good in this. Like I loved the way that he made this movie. And I loved that shot of them on the cruise, and it's the two kids standing by the pool, and you see the man floating in the water, and she's like, take a picture of me. And that picture is later like what she leaves him and like becomes his totem of her. And she writes on the back of it like, wait for me. And so it's interesting too when you understand that, and then you understand that like when he's looking at this picture and thinking about it and stuff too, which at the beginning of the film you see he has sealed in a bag, like it's very precious to him. Like in the background of that was death, and I think that that's like such an interesting way of it's such a good film, but it's also, I have so many issues with it. But I just loved that, like the way that the cruise works as it works as like the way of intercutting his childhood and the way that he's perceiving things and his fears and like what's driving him, and then the water and everything too, and his mother and like the intimacy with his mother when they're laying in bed together, and then this other woman, which granted they're children, but comes in and is like, I love you, and it threatens her, and she's like, what's going on? And so I think that there's like a lot of really dense and thoughtful metaphor there in the way that he's kind of trying to grapple with how his mother maybe caused him to feel like emasculated because of fear, or that he needed to always be afraid of the world, and that if he ever slept with a woman he would die, and so it's like he has all of these things that he's trying to work out, and I think the cruise was like a really interesting way of doing that, especially the fact that it is a cruise and kind of relating childhood to like this breezy thing where like, you know, you don't really have to worry about it, and then you're just there with your mom, and it's this vacation element, and then all of a sudden you grow up a little bit and you start noticing other girls and how that works, and so I thought that was really good. And then tying into like the ending when she reappears and he's like, I waited for you and you worked for my mother this whole time, and so it makes you kind of wonder, like, did his mother recognize the attraction there and like hire her on in order to keep tabs on her, in order to keep her away from him? And so you see all of the ways that his mother has been protecting him from the world, but more importantly has been removing him from the world and keeping him cloistered off and unable to experience the world. And so when he's finally able to like confront his mother, or confront like the removal of his mother and actually be able to experience life when he thinks his mother is dead, and it's like this woman comes back in, and he gets to have this experience finally, but then it ends exactly the way his mom said, and then she reappears, and so it's just like, I think it's important to kind of like tie that together, because it feeds in so much to how that part of the film works, because you only really see her as a character in those cruise scenes before.
Yeah. And was that the same actress playing her? I don't think it was.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, they looked very similar. Maybe it was just through makeup, but I really like the scene where she was describing to him the way his father died, not because of what she was saying, but because, well, even though it was interesting, but like I just loved the sort of like shifting back and forth, like red and blue that was on her face.
Yeah, it was like multicolored. It was great from like his nightlight. I loved that.
Yeah, that was really good.
And his nightlight was fish.
Yeah, there's definitely a water imagery, a water motif going on here.
Maybe I'm just caught up on this, but I feel like it's really throughout.
No, it's definitely, like, it's undeniable. Like, you have the scene where he's in the bathtub multiple times, and then there's that one scene, which is a crazy scene, where the guy falls on top of him.
I forgot about that. Oh my gosh, that scene had me cracking up. Oh my gosh. Okay, yeah, sorry, I just completely forgot about that. And then everything with like the brown recluse spider and like the idea of things being hidden in your home that will attack you when you least expect it. Yeah, manifestations of things.
Yeah, for sure. And then you can't deny that there's like the death thing going on in water too. I mean, the fact that that guy is like floating dead in the water. Yeah, there's definitely something going on there. But yeah, so I guess we're pretty much at the end. I think like.
What did you think about everything with the mother though and the fake death?
I think it's interesting. I think it's sort of more of her being revealed as this sort of like just villainous character in his life. I think even if she's doing bad things before, like you can still sort of think maybe you can go either way on it. Like maybe it's not intentional, but then when she comes back, she's sort of like monologuing at him and saying all these like really emotionally destructive things.
She leans into him like hardcore. And yeah, I didn't mean to cut off your thought. I have like I feel like I keep tangenting. I have a lot of thoughts about this movie. But like with, to kind of touch back on the bathtub thing, and then like, I mean, the attic happens in that scene, or in that part. So I feel like the return, so he's been isolated, he's been smothered, he's gone through the forest of self-discovery and come out on the other side. And on the other side, he has to face his childhood. And so he goes to his home, his mother's home. And I love the moment, too, where she's like, this isn't your home. This is my home. It will always be your home, but it's my home. And you get a sense for her mentality. And actually, as I'm talking about it, I'm softening up a little bit because I do understand, like, she is given a thoughtful perspective, and you see that a lot of the stuff that she's been driven by has been her own harms.
Well, I was going to say, there's a pretty funny moment, even though it's dark, when she's talking about how her mother abused her, and then a demon woman, like...
It's so funny, and, like, the little curls.
Yeah, that was really good.
It's so comical. It's unreal. It makes you laugh. I love those moments. But I think, like, the funniest, and I actually, like, cracked up at this. Oh, my gosh. But can I just say, as a quick aside, the funniest recurring bit in the movie to me was the choice of music. Oh, my God. His music choices were so funny. Like,
well, they've been talking about the Mariah Carey at the end. That's a pretty big one.
Yeah, so funny. That scene especially where she's like, hold on, let me restart the song. I was like dying. I thought that was so funny. But yeah, music is great in that, and it's such a good comic relief. It's such a good like emotional buoy through everything that's happening. And reminds me of like my own weird experiences with the music in that regard. But another story for another day, I guess. But yeah, I lost my train of thought. The mother, yes, she's driven by her own traumas, her own mother who didn't give her enough attention, and so she became a helicopter parent. And I think it's really interesting too because it is very representative of generational parenting, where our parents had a different parenting style from their parents, and so it's like very real in that element.
Well, I was just thinking, I was having the thought that like you think sometimes, or at least with me, or I don't, whatever, like you think of like something that your parents did to you was so bad, but then you start thinking like what happened to them, what were their parents like,
right?
And even more so in my case, I think what were my grandparents' parents like,
right?
Because I've met my grandparents, but then when you imagine that thing that you've never experienced, you sort of literally just imagine like a demon, which is what was on the wall.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's kind of like that's what the joke was, at least I think.
Yeah, and I definitely get that. I think it's really good that we're having this conversation. I mean, we would have had it anyway, but I think it's good that we're having this conversation because talking out these things is actually helping me kind of like frame it a little bit differently in my head. I think I've been very acutely attentive to certain portrayals of women, and I think that when things like click for me, it's hard for me to kind of like step back from that perspective, which is my own thing that I'm working on, just being a person. But yeah, I think that the framing of her getting to understand, like, he's going back, and now that he's an adult and he's had these experiences, he's actually able to see his mother for who she is, for a person. It's almost as if, like, his perception of his mother is the one that died, and so I love that she's faceless. And then, like, when his mother does reappear, he has to work out all of this stuff, and I think it's really good that, like, I love when the therapist walks out of the bathroom.
He was like working with her all along.
Yeah, and then they have like these huge speakers set up that I don't know if they were there before, but it's like these kind of like studio.
Well, it's like the worst thing that could be done to him. Like if you go to therapy, like, you know, you're trusting your therapist with everything, and then to have literally, you know, everything, every intimate moment you've discussed with your therapist played on loudspeakers.
Oh God.
Is like a sort of comical nightmare, like worst fear.
That's one of my worst fears. It's relatable. But yeah, I thought that moment was really great. But then getting into like the attic and bathtub where we kind of jumped off from this point, the bathtub is really great where it's not just a literal physical death, it's like an emotional death too, where it's like you see her like drowning, like get in the tub, like, you know, it's parenting, but it's also smothering and drowning, and that is compared like or contrasted with the attic and everything, where it's like very isolated. And one of the funniest parts, this is where I got caught away because the music is so great, but one of the funniest parts in the film is the reveal of the father. And it took me a second to be like, this is fucking goofy, what is this? But what's interesting, because it starts to kind of reveal that maybe death isn't really death, before he actually gets to experience that, like, for real. But yeah, so penis monster, hilarious, so dumb, so goofy, but like that's kind of the thing, is like he deals with these things that are super dark and then makes it like very goofy, like the panning to the grandmother, and she's just like, she just looks like a cartoon, and it's so funny. But then I was thinking about it, and I was like, why did he make the dad a giant dick monster? Yeah. And then I was like, probably because his dad was a massive dick, and then I was like, duh. Yeah. And so it like really kind of works for me in that moment, where I was just like, yeah, probably she, like, maybe she said that his dad was dead, but then we know that his dad wasn't dead.
Well, I think if you think of stories like people talking about like classic sort of abandonment, like, you know, just the drunken dad who left and didn't give a shit about anything, you could just represent that as a penis monster.
Right, like he was a massive dick. And I think that it's great in the scene before too, when he's going into the woods and they have that line where it's like, the way that they met will be told differently depending on who tells it. And so that kind of ties back into like later the mom, probably he was just like a massive dick and she didn't want him in his life. And clearly she had like she was very an affluent person, and probably was able to just like be like, you, I'm moving on. So like one night stand, we can interpret it as a one night stand. And so I thought that was really interesting. And so the way that she was able to tell him as a kid was just like he died, which is really fucked up. But you start to understand her mentality, and that she's always had to kind of like look out for herself. She didn't really have that support. She didn't have anybody there to take care of her. And so she was just like, they may as well be dead. And so they were. And so then, but what I keep thinking about though is the way that the guy who was chasing Beau smashes through the window and doesn't
just comes back out of nowhere.
Yeah, he comes out of nowhere, and so you kind of understand that like he's not a real person. He's like just masculinity on rampage or something. Maybe you have different thoughts on that. But the fact that he comes in and tries to destroy the image of his father, tries to like kill this thing, but ultimately can't. And he's like impaled through the head. I thought that was really interesting. So yeah, it's like his mother is smothering him and drowning him and killing a part of him. But then at the same time, she's trying to protect him from abandonment and from this person who was never there and who had probably caused his own harm and may have caused harm to Beau that he would have, you know, that he was being protected from. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting how he kind of like. It's interesting because like through the whole film he's trying to, like, he has these desires to be a father, but then at the end he sees like what his father was. So do you have any thoughts on that? I keep
Oh no. Yeah, I just thought it was interesting. I thought the sort of penis monster thing, I was just thinking about like, sort of reminds me of Possession, Have you seen that movie?
Well, yeah, I have seen Possession. I've seen it a few times. I feel like we talked about this. Maybe it didn't. But yeah, the monster at the end and the manifestation of of their ideals and everything too.
Yeah, much more comical than Possession.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh, Possession is like buckle up. This one is a little bit more like have a drink, have 2 drinks. Yeah.
I was thinking about a lot of movies throughout. I mean, there's obviously Synecdoche, New York, which I think even with the nightmare sort of like just urban chaos at the beginning, the city turns post-apocalyptic.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, and there's definitely that. It sort of reminded me, I don't know if you've seen this movie, but of Zardoz, which I just watched recently. It's a movie with Sean Connery from like the early 70s.
No.
I won't spoil too much about that, but it's a very strange movie. Yeah, I mean, you could say The Truman Show in some small way. Maybe with just some of the stuff at the very end where he's just sort of just questioning what is reality and what is life. But, yeah. But just talk about what happens at the very end.
Yeah.
So his mother's just, pretty much says that she hates him at a certain point, and then he just strangles her. And then she probably dies. And he runs off. And he goes into sort of has like a crazed look in his face, and he gets on a boat and goes through like a tunnel, and then when he gets through the tunnel, he's back on water again on the boat, and then he's in this sort of defending your life situation where he's literally in a coliseum, and the mother's lawyer from the beginning is he's sort of on trial. He has a defender on a very opposite end that can't be heard. It doesn't seem like anything he's saying is getting through. And then he's being guilted and shamed for every little thing he's ever done wrong. So what did you think of that final scene?
I didn't like it. Just to be frank, I didn't like it. I get it, but I think it was a little bit self-congratulating, is how I kind of read it. I didn't feel like it connected with me in the way that maybe he intended it to, which is okay. I know a lot of people really liked the film, and that honestly is kind of where like I started to become a little bit like I was checking out. I was ready to be done, but like kind of starting from where you started your thought, like the fact that he's like strangling his mother, and I think that even the staging of that event is so interesting because she's pushing him, and she's like, she tells him everything that he hopes he would never hear but always believed, kind of like I said before, it's like this kind of idea of paradoxical intention, and I feel like that's what he's kind of working.
You just don't want it confirmed.
Yeah, so it's like he finally, like you hear even in the therapy bit before, like the therapist asks him a question and he's like, I don't know, but then like in the moment he's like, yes, and so he's kind of finally facing this thing, but he's facing it like to an extreme. So like what is the worst possible thing your mom could say if she heard your therapist sessions, and then she does that, and so he almost again tries to like kill this version of his mom, like even though like the past version of his mom is already dead or has been replaced by this newer, more real version of his mom, and I think it's really interesting that experience or that exchange or event ends with her. She collapses into like a terrarium, but what struck me is the fact that she falls back into a box. And so it's like you don't know if she's alive or dead, and it almost doesn't really matter because he has compartmentalized her again. And he's kind of put her in a space where, like, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I just felt like of all of the places he could have her die, the fact that she falls into a glass case that is perfectly body-sized. She's not falling into, like, an aquarium or onto the floor. Like, she's falling into a box. And I just felt like, for me, I interpreted that so much as, like, the compartment. so he like he is able to again compartmentalize this idea of his mom, but then it's challenged again. So if we are to relate water to death, then at the end, I honestly thought that it was going to be an ending where he just walks into the water, but instead he gets on a boat. But I feel like it's similar.
Well, honestly, I feel like that's what happened. I feel like I almost interpreted it as that he committed suicide.
Yes.
But then, like, everything that happens at the end is just sort of like death dream, what you happens right before you die.
Yeah. I read it the same way.
Yeah, so I feel like he did walk right in the water because, like, he didn't, like, there wouldn't just be a boat there.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
but
and then it kind of plays with like the river Styx idea, almost like he takes a boat. And I also really like the book ending where like the film starts with the birth canal and then ends with a death canal. Like he's going into this tunnel on this boat, and it's kind of like into another world. And it turns out it's like a mega dome, and suddenly he's on trial for everything he's ever done wrong in his life. But he's on trial with his mother. And yeah, I did like the point where like his mother and her attorney were able to be like super loud, and then like his defense was like, by the way. So it kind of like ties into this feeling of like, it very much was like his mental collapse at the end. Mm-hmm. But I felt like it was very, I think I said self-aggrandizing or self-congratulating, because it just felt like at a certain point it wasn't for the audience anymore. It was just for him to be like, Mom, this is every shitty thing you've ever said about me, and maybe you're right. Like, it just felt like, I just didn't really feel like it gave like a resolution. And then at the end, like the boat flips and the water takes him as you would expect, and it just felt like a weird resolution, and it felt like a weird note to end on. And like maybe that's the point, that there is no resolution, and that the things that like traumatize you sometimes will traumatize you until the very end, especially super impactful relationships like parents. But I just felt like if he had just cut out, like if he had just like had it end with like him driving a boat into a tunnel or something, I would have been like, amazing. But the fact that like he had this whole extra part where like he's on trial by his mom, it just felt, I don't know, I didn't like it. I
mean, I see what you're saying, but I just, like, I saw it also as like what you were saying, that like this trauma never really goes away. There's never really any real resolution to it. It's just constant pain, and like it will feel like, I guess you can't have this because it's literally just from Beau's perspective, because Beau is afraid. But his mom would have, you can make a movie about the mom where you have the perspective that everything wrong was done to her, but we're in Beau's perspective, so it's like everything wrong being done to him.
Right.
So it's like, it's almost like just this war that happens between parents and children. Not always. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, I don't know. Maybe it's just like my own, what I want. I didn't get what I wanted. Mm-hmm. I think that I had just kind of hoped for some sort of different resolution, and maybe that's the point. You don't get what you want. Your expectations of how things are going to end aren't going to be, and maybe you expect that you will die surrounded by your loved ones, but in fact you die surrounded by people
surrounded by water, surrounded
by people you don't know, don't recognize. It kind of frames his life as this very performative act too. It also frames his life as something he has to justify, and I think that's interesting. So yeah, maybe it's just the point that, like, you know, you would hope that you would die in certain circumstances, but maybe you just die like thinking about the trauma your mom left you with. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm being too critical. There were some other elements too in the film near the end that I didn't really like. Like I hated the fact that like she staged her death with, just to step back a little bit, she staged her death by paying her housekeeper of 35 years to die so that she could use her body. Like, I think
that's just sort of like a, you know, parasitic wealth commentary kind of thing.
Yeah, it's very much a commentary on capitalism and elitism and like using people, especially people in the service industry, and the fact that like so many, like this industry, domestic service is almost always done by women, and So yeah, it's a commentary on that, but it also just like didn't really make me feel very good. Maybe I just need feel good movies right now, Drew. Everything else I'm being hypercritical of.
Well, it's a comedy. I mean,
wow, yeah.
I'm just kidding. It's a very dark comedy.
You're right. I feel great. No, I'm just kidding. I think that I have kind of been in a very specific mindset lately, and so things that don't that challenge me are maybe making me bristle a little bit more than they should. As we've been talking about this, I have softened a bit to it. My rating in my head has gone up during this conversation. So yeah, I mean, maybe it was just him trying to shove in as much commentary as he could at every point, and he does do a lot. I mean, like, even in the first act, there's like that great shot that's used in the trailer too of him walking across the bridge, and there's like a guy with a gun just like out in public, and it's this
I love that part.
AR-15. So, you know, I'm sure it is just like an inclusion of those sort of social commentaries. But I don't know. I just feel like parts of it, it's so maybe like half baked that it's just like, why put it in? But I don't know.
Well, sort of Ari Aster throwing everything at the canvas.
See what sticks.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that I just need to understand that, like, my personal perspective is maybe a little bit more critical on certain things just because of what I have been taking in and experiencing in my own life recently. I think it's a good film. I think it's definitely... I liked it more than Hereditary. I think that's easy for me to say. Where it falls with Midsommar, I'll have to rewatch that one in order to decide, but I think that this one would be above Midsommar for me. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting because I'll say I like the film for sure. It's like, just to give it a rating, I'll give it a 4 out of 5.
Okay.
But just to get that out of the way, what would you rate it?
So, actually, I think I will come in the same, like a very even 4. I was kind of around like a 3.5 when we first started talking, but I think I just needed to kind of process my perspective on the film rather than just saying that I'm right.
Yeah. Well, I didn't like it as much as Hereditary or Midsommar because I love those movies. I give those like heavy 5s.
He's a great director.
Mm-hmm. And to me, it just didn't emotionally. Even though it's like it's relatable and you can relate to many people's lives, it didn't emotionally impact me the way that Hereditary and Midsommar did. Mm. The only part that really kind of hit me, and it didn't hit me anywhere near as hard as parts in Hereditary or Midsommar, but the only part that really kind of hit me was in the middle, when the angel character is like telling him like you were too busy being selfish and to live your life and all these things.
Too busy being selfish, too busy being scared. I loved the shot of like the axe sliding out and him like breaking his chain. So yeah, I feel like there's a lot of like he's trying to like deal with this stuff and move on to something else. And I feel like he's done that a lot in his films. Like his films very much deal with like familial trauma. And so this kind of isn't surprising in his catalog in that regard. It's just kind of another way of approaching it. I think he's a great director. I think it's one where I would love to watch it again at home and kind of like think about it a little bit more in depth. There were a few times when we were watching it when I was like almost going to lean over and be like, what do you think about but there's just like, I feel like I could take notes on this movie. There's so much. It's so dense. It's so personal, and you kind of have to admire someone being willing to be so vulnerable with what they're going through and what they're grappling with. And so yeah, I really liked it with some caveats. And maybe on another viewing I'll soften to it even more. But yeah, for now I think a 4 is very fair, and I feel like I've rated his other films around there. Yeah. I don't remember.
Yeah. I mean, it was good. I'd definitely like to rewatch it. For a 3-hour movie, I thought it had a good pace. I mean, maybe you can feel the length a little bit, but it doesn't feel dreadfully slow at any point. I think it has a good pace to it.
Yeah, I was surprised by that too. I think I actually even said that to you as we were walking out. Like, I was worried about how it was going to feel, and I definitely started to feel it near the end. Partly because I had to use the bathroom, and partly because it just kind of like started to feel a little bit like like beating a dead horse, I guess. Like it all was valid and all served the ultimate point, but I just kind of was like ready to be done near the end. But yeah, it's also tricky because it's one of those films where like it's so long, but he doesn't give you any opportunity to like get up to use the bathroom if you need to. There were a few times where I almost did, and then I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I didn't, because if I had, I'd missed that 30 seconds that totally tied into. It's very like he loves. I feel like he loves like throwing like very important plot points and like very small things.
Yeah, there was lots of stuff like written on the wall, like at the beginning, and all kinds of little things.
Yeah, but like even in the sense of like the photo, like if I had walked out to use the bathroom at the part where he flipped it over and showed the back message where she's like, wait for me, like I would have missed that whole part. And so it's like not necessarily the most convenient for a thirsty viewer, but overall the time went by pretty easily.
Yeah, I mean, I'd been looking forward to it. I enjoyed it, and I think that's pretty much all I have to say. Did you have any other thoughts?
Gosh, I'm sure I'm going to say no, and an hour from now I'm going to be like, I wish I would have said that. But no, I feel like that pretty much encompasses my perspective on the film. But yeah, I'm always happy to chat about it more.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being here, and thanks for meeting me here at the Mayan Theatre to see Beau is Afraid. I think that's pretty much it. Thank you guys for being here, and I'll see you next time. Bye.